right, so now we're going to begin the next lesson. We're going to be working on the end of the Cold War. Remember that the Cold War began right after World War II, when we did not tell USSR that we had an atomic weapon, and they continued to push other countries like China to fall to communism. And so that kind of began a Cold War in which we never really fought against each other, but we fought proxy wars with each other in other ways. Led to the space race, it led to the arms race, led to Korea, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. All right, and this lesson is going to have, this is the main question. How did the Bush administration respond to the end of the Cold War? 3 parts to this lesson. You're going to learn about the collapse of the USSR and the end of the Cold War, the change in Eastern Europe or communism's end, and the future of communism, mostly found in China and Cuba. Now, can't really talk about the end of communism until we talk about H.W. Bush, or who I call Papa Bush, because his son becomes president later on. Now, Papa Bush was Reagan's vice president. He was really good at international affairs or issues. He had dealt with them a number of times. And he was, this is super important, guys, he was very, very, very trusting. Much more trusting, misspelled Reagan here, much more trusting than Gorbachev. He had been trusting Gorbachev as the leader of the USSR. He was talking to them, becoming an ally with them. Reagan hadn't been very trusting. He had been more prepared just in case there was a fight. Now, Gorbachev and Papa Bush become allies, and they negotiated arms or weapons reduction. They signed also a pact to end the Cold War. All right, well, who is Gorbachev? Gorbachev is the premier or the leader of USSR. Remember that USSR was made of Russia and other states or other countries that had joined or had been pressured to join them at the end of World War II. Okay, so he's going to do reforms. He's going to reshape things. First of all, he's going to call it perestroika. Perestroika means openness. He wants to create a free market where the people can decide what they want and businesses can decide what to make. But this is going to be a really slow progress, and there's going to be a lot of shortages and long lines like during COVID. Because the businesses were so used to the government telling them what to do, what to make, when to make it, when they were given that choice, it made it really hard. They weren't really sure of what to continue as they had their own businesses. He also has another kind of reform, and he calls it glasnost. And glasnost means that there's more freedom of speech. Back in the day, if you lived in the USSR, you couldn't protest. Well, you could, but you might not be alive the next day. You couldn't really voice your opinion against the government. And he says, let's do that. Let's give people a voice. And people see and they learn of how much corruption has been going on in the USSR, and people start to protest. It's like a civil unrest. So although Gorbachev wanted to do these 2 things to help his country progress, kind of blew up in his face because the people didn't know what to do with this newfound freedom, and they start protesting when they hear of all the bad things the government's actually doing. This leads to the next part. There is an attempted coup. Now, it's not coup. You say the word coup. Okay, it's a French word. And it's basically a takeover by top leaders who didn't like all the changes in the USSR. Even though Gorbachev was okay with the changes, some of the top dogs that were with him didn't want all these changes. They wanted to keep their corruption and their power. And they were trying to overthrow the government when they see everything that Gorbachev is doing. So what ends up happening, sadly, is that Gorbachev and his party gets destroyed. They don't get killed necessarily, but they get taken apart. And a new leader rises up. And this new leader is Boris Yeltsin. And he actually begins what he calls the disintegration or the dismantling of the USSR. The USSR, Russia, and all its satellite countries, it begins to fall apart. Little by little, they begin to disband and they break up. And various leaders or countries declare their independence. So remember, a state can also be a country, like we are the United States. So we're made up of 50 different states. That was the USSR, the United Soviet States of Russia. They break up, and these countries, super important here, they declare their independence. This leads to what Reagan used to say, no more USSR, no more evil empire. Now remember, Reagan saw it like that, but not so much Papa George H.W. Bush. This left Russia, just Russia is left from this collapse. That means that it's no longer USSR, it's just Russia, like what we know today. Now, second part of the lesson, changes in Europe as communism ends. So communism is going to take a little bit, maybe 4 or 5 years to completely end. But one of the big things that causes communism to fall is the fall of the Berlin Wall in Germany. It comes down in 1989. This wall symbolized the great division that communism have brought. Remember, that wall was built between East and West Germany. And remember, West Germany has been surrounded and the people, their family had been divided by this literal wall. The wall begins to come down when actually they have protests, and the people themselves with hammer and chisels, they begin to bring the wall down. And again, what happens is East and West Germany are united again. Remember that this wall symbolized communist oppression. And now countries are going to be set free. Countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Yugoslavian republics, East Germany, Albania, and there's a reunification of East and West Germany, and they were helped by the USA and they become part of NATO. Now, everything is pretty good except that when the Yugoslavia separates, within Yugoslavia itself, they had a lot of countries that wanted to be separate. These individual states, they begin to declare independence, but because of ethnic and religious beliefs and tensions, here's something shocking, many Christians begin to kill Muslims because they wanted to have their own law, their own religion, their own practices, and so between these territories erupted a civil war. Okay, so all the countries that were released or declared their independence were also called the Eastern Bloc. Okay, so now we're going to have a brand new Europe, a new European Union, an EU, and they're united under one single currency or money called the euro. So if you go to Germany, you can use the same money maybe in France. They all are using a common currency. And they are trying to kind of create a united Europe. Now, the future of communism. We're going to really focus on this lesson in China and Cuba. Now, even though communism had collapsed in Eastern Europe, it continues in countries like North Korea, Vietnam, China, and Cuba. Remember, Cuba has been tricky because it's only 90 miles away. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis where they were pointing missiles and how when we failed to remove Fidel Castro. Okay, so what is going to happen to these countries when there's a new Europe? Well, sadly, we see that China, misspelled here, sorry, and Cuba, they remain communist. They have now no economic or military support from USSR. But even though that's going to hurt them, they realize they have a renewed action or renewed feeling to keep communism by their leader, Fidel Castro. In China, students begin to protest, and not Chia, guys, China. Students begin to protest and want democracy. Hundreds or maybe thousands of young people go to this famous place called the Tiananmen Square, and they begin to say, we do not want communist China, we want democracy in China. They're killed. This is where you'll see that famous picture of a man standing in front of all these tanks. He was not crushed, he was taken out of the way. But thousands of students were killed, and it kind of showed that China, no matter what, was going to continue to stay communist. So as China is still communist today, it is very powerful, and it has a very powerful economic system. Along with that, it blames, though, the US blames China for stealing our technological ideas. They say, yes, you make our stuff, but you also steal our technological ideas. But the USA and China still rely on each other quite a bit for business and for trade. And it's kind of a given. Remember that I taught you with Nixon when he visited China, it's realpolitik. Look, you're going to be who you want to be. I'm going to be who I want to be. It's all about the money. Even though sometimes we don't like each other or agree with each other's policies or laws, we're still going to continue to make business. You're not going to change and I'm not going to change. So we're just going to continue to work together. So all these things lead to what we called the end of the Cold War. Remember, it was about 50 years that the Cold War took place between the USSR and the United States. Remember that there is no more USSR. Many of those states declared their independence, and today USSR is Russia, and it continues to be communist. I hope this helps. If you want, take notes, stop it as you go along and copy the same notes.